I'm Holly Page, co-founder of No Labels. Welcome to the latest edition of No Labels Talks with the beacon of light, the voice of the common sense majority, my friend and colleague, Ryan Clancy.
No, that's a good intro for a podcast. That would also be a good intro for a cult leader.
Well, listen, we might have to go that route. We don't know yet. Let's keep
beacon
all
of
options on the table.
The beacon of light.
Exactly. Well, I'm in San Francisco, so I've got a very spiritual, I'm trying to reconnect with the West Coast vibes out here. But at any rate, Ryan, okay, 19 days to go. What are you thinking?
Well, it's interesting. So I was talking yesterday to a political analyst I really respect, and he said something that really got my attention, which is we're of course all fixated on this election and the outcome, and as we should be. But one thing he said this election is going to decide nothing. And his point was, we're still in the middle of this huge realignment of our politics. And people are not satisfied with where we're headed. They're not satisfied with either party. So many people are voting not for affirmative reasons. I like this person. It's because they're voting against something, which I think is a reminder of the importance of what we're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and also why we have No Labels, why we started No Labels to begin with. I love the analogy, and I often use it, that most of politics, 95%, is focused on election day. And that's like spending all your time and energy just thinking about the wedding. But it is the marriage that actually matters, and is where all the work and all the reward is. So I know that we are busy thinking about how we move the country forward, how we work with our allies in the House and Senate, regardless of who is in the White House. And we've got a big conference on the 12th of December. Happens to be Frank Sinatra's birthday, by the way.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I know. So he'll be, sprinkling his magic from above because he loved this country. So where we're going to help connect all the dots between the leaders and the No Label supporters around the country who want to see a different path for the country.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this as it's like an opportunity to kind of like a dividing line to say, in effect, hey, the election's over. Because look, what's going to happen is we'll have the election. There'll probably be challenges, and then there'll be the losing side will have to have a mourning period. We'll have to just work through their feelings. But at a certain point, you got to say, all right, we got to get up and focus on governing. And I think, some people have observed this idea of the permanent campaign. It's like as soon as a campaign ends, the other one begins. I think that's one thing that No Labels tries to work against. We try to, interrupt that cycle and say, wait a minute, before we start talking about 2026 or 2028, how about we focus on governing for a little while?
Exactly, which of course lends itself so beautifully to talking about the whole series of No Labels Talks podcast and the serious issues that you do a fabulous job making sense of for the rest of us. But we've got a particularly concerning topic this week. You want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, if you look at the polling and voters, the issues they care about most, it is inflation and immigration. It is very much a one classic kitchen table set of issues. But presidencies have a way of being defined by events completely outside their control, and the foreign policy and defense arena may well be the thing that defines the next administration, because our speaker today walked through a lot of the threats we're facing in the Middle East with the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran, Russia, Ukraine, China. So many hot spots around the world that could really erupt at any moment and could consume the next presidency in ways we just don't expect.
I saw George Will had an editorial saying basically there already is a global war happening. And it reminds me of the debt and deficit issues, and thinking about why our candidates and our elected officials aren't having a more honest conversation with American voters. I think we can take it out here. We just want to know what we're really contending with. So it is a matter of leadership. And it, again, is one of the reasons why we do what we do, because we want to make it safe for leaders with the best interests of the nation to speak to voters and citizens honestly.
Well, we've said this, I think, on a previous podcast that Harris and Trump both have been just trying to outcompete one another to give things away. And again, and our next speaker talks about the debt as a security issue. And so again, events just may well intervene to shape the next president's term in ways we don't expect. But so our speaker is Dr. Kori Schake from the American Enterprise Institute. We spoke to her before. She's such a sharp thinker. She used to be in the State Department and the National Security Council in the Bush administration. And so, and she's got a new book coming out. So she talks us through what issues she thinks on the foreign policy arena are really going to define the next term. So everybody enjoy this week's edition of No Labels Talks with Dr. Kori Schake. With us is somebody who actually gets the award for the most committed guest we've ever had, because she's in Italy right now. And yet she decided she would take an hour out of her day to be with us. We're very lucky to have her. This is Dr. Kori Schake, who is a senior.
She is thrilled to have the opportunity to have this conversation.
Oh, wow. Okay. I appreciate that. She has been on with us before. This is Dr. Kori Schake, who is a senior fellow and director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She has a new book coming out, really experienced foreign policy advisor in the Bush administration, where she worked at the National Security Council, the State Department. Kori, for starters, what is this new book about that you're working on?
So it is a history of civil-military relations in the United States, an attempt to answer for a general readership. How is it that a country that was founded in fear of a standing army has come to think of its military as a major bulwark of democracy? Like, what's the arc of that story? And that's what I'm trying to explain.
By the way, the fact that we, of course, have civil control over our military here in the United States, is that the convention in other advanced countries in Europe or elsewhere?
It is extraordinarily rare for a country to have a military as influential in policymaking and as publicly admired as our military, and yet for that military to be comfortably subordinate to civilian authority. You typically either get one or the other. In most advanced democracies, you don't have militaries who have the political weight in policymaking or the public admiration that the American military has. And in authoritarian societies, you have militaries that are very influential, but that do not respect the subordination to civilian leadership.
Yeah. Gallup just did a big poll today about public trust in all our civic and political institutions, and everything is rock bottom. No one trusts the media, no one trusts the courts, no one trusts Congress, anything. But they do trust the military, and they trust small businesses as an institution. And that's pretty much it in terms of above water, in terms of people.
Yeah. It's actually one of the things that caused me to write the book was in the last decade or two, the collapse of public confidence in institutions of government and civic life, and the sustained high rate of support for the military has actually destabilized a little bit the American model of civil-military relations. And what you see is politicians hiding behind the military to gain public support for their beliefs. You see it in the appointment of senior veterans to major cabinet positions by both political parties. You see candidates for office either trumpeting their military experience or placing military figures in their advertisements. And so the problem isn't high public support for the military. That's actually a very good, very healthy thing, given that the military has the ability to wreak violence. It's good that the public trusts them in civic space, but it's actually not good for our democracy that the support for the military is so much higher than support for religious organizations, for government, for journalists, for the vibrancy of our civil society and our civilian governance.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, Kori, I wrote an op-ed about this years ago, about that at a certain point, because of the exact phenomenon you described, and it was particularly true during the conflict in Iraq, you would often see politicians say, well, I'm just going to do what the generals tell me. And they got it backwards. No, your job is to tell the generals what to do. Now, they're going to go execute it, and they're going to do it capably. But in some ways, that's a way of kind of like outsourcing decision-making and responsibility.
That is exactly right, Ryan. And you not only see the political leadership doing it. When Jim Mattis and I wrote our book on civil military relations in 2015, we had YouGov do the largest set of surveys of public attitudes that had been done in 25 or so years since the triangle study of the late 1990s. And it's actually shocking the extent to which the American public has outsourced its judgment to the military and to veterans on national security issues. Something like 45% of Americans surveyed had no opinion on major issues of war, peace, defense spending, strategy. They were waiting for the military or veteran voices to help them understand how to think about this. And that's a natural consequence of being, 50 years into a small volunteer military.
Well, Kori, we're going to look forward to that book when it comes out. It'll be sometime next year, I take it? That's great. Yeah. Well, Kori, let me ask you something about, it's a little more current and on the minds of everybody, which is what's going on in the Middle East. And we really have some significant developments over the last couple of days, particularly as it relates to the situation in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon. It was announced yesterday, a couple things. Number one, it came out that the White House has apparently communicated to Israel it is not going to keep sending weapons unless more humanitarian aid is getting into Gaza. That was development one. Development two was apparently, and I don't know if this was leaked, Israel is apparently telling the US side they will not, when they respond to the latest Iranian missile attack, be targeting the Iranian nuclear or oil facilities. And then we learned today that they're ready to do it. Their counter against the Iranians, it's just not clear when they're going to do it and what exactly they're going to do. What should we make of all this, Kori? What's happening? What should we expect to see unfold over the course of the next couple of weeks here?
This is such an important set of issues. I would branch it out into two separate pieces of the conversation, if you don't mind, Brian. The first is what Israel is doing in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria. So what Al-Qaeda used to call the near fight, right? The Iranian proxies who have the ability, and as we're at the sorrowful anniversary of Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel of October 7th, 2023, Israel's response to that, they have set a war aims that military force is unlikely to achieve, right? The complete eradication of Hamas. But it makes political sense why they would do that, because after the attacks, it's totally understandable that Israelis don't feel like they can live in safety as long as Hamas is able to operate out of Gaza. But the way the way Israel is conducting operations in Gaza is likely to generate the next generation of Hamas operatives. And I say that with sorrow. I mean, there's no military that's good at urban operations. We're not good at it. The Israelis aren't good at it. Nobody's good at it. It's objectively a very difficult task. And even though the Israelis are attempting to be restrained, that's not how Palestinians in Gaza are experiencing it. And moreover, we are so far distant from warfare that, we forget that, we killed more than 10,000 French civilians in the weeks of the Normandy landings. We killed more than 10,000 Syrians and Iraqis during the counter-ISIS fight. And we also did not provide humanitarian assistance to the areas in which we were fighting. We are expanding the definition of how militaries should operate to such a degree that our own military forces are unlikely to be able to meet the standard we are setting for Israelis. And we should be more worried about that than we are worried about it. So that's one piece of it, the extraordinarily difficult and the likely unattainable standards Israelis have set for themselves, and those of us sitting in judgment of Israel's operations are expecting of them. The second piece of it, I think, is what Al-Qaeda calls the far fight, which is, what do you do about an Iran that is destabilizing regional governments, that has a spider web of proxies in Yemen, in Syria, in Gaza, in Lebanon, that are attempting to destroy the state of Israel and other Arab states in the region. And there, I think the United States, Israel, and their regional allies have actually done an incredibly good job. So the Israelis, if at some level they acknowledge they can't eradicate Hamas, they're trying to reestablish deterrence with Iran. That's what they're doing with the moonshots of these assassination attempts and other espionage operations. They're trying to remind themselves and others what they are good at, that they can hold a leadership at risk, that they can disrupt complex operations, because what they're trying to do is throw a brushback pitch that will get the Iranians to stop doing what they are doing in mobilizing proxy organizations. And I think they've been pretty good at that. And the third piece of it, I promise I'll stop after this, Ryan. The third piece of it is the way the United States and Israel have orchestrated the Arab countries in the region, Jordan, Egypt, the countries of the Gulf states, external countries like France and the United States, that, the Iranians told a Gulf state what they were going to do in the April attack on Israel. That Arab state told Israel and the United States, and that gave us the opportunity of a couple of weeks' time to organize the defense of Israel. And I think actually Iran had to be stunned both by the ineffectiveness of their attempt to inflict major civilian damage on Israel. And they also had to be shocked by the breadth, even with what Israel is doing in Gaza, the breadth of Arab support that Israel and the United States had. The last thing I will say is, Iran fired something like 357 drones and missiles at Israel. 350 were intercepted. But if any of those seven that had not been intercepted had been nuclear, we would be in a very different place than we are now.
So whatever happens, Kori, in the next couple weeks, as it relates to Israel's response, should we understand that as yet another brushback pitch, which is to say, Israel is not looking to escalate this to a full-on conflict between the two nations, that this is the next step in their trying to reestablish deterrence?
So it's a great question, and I'm honestly not sure. I am honestly not sure whether Israel is simply trying to reestablish deterrence at this point, or whether the success they have achieved against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against Iran might cause them to expand their expectations. That happens very often historically. Once a country starts to succeed, they start to get greedy and they expand their war efforts. And it's entirely plausible to me that Israel would think that for the first 6 months after Hamas's attack on Israel, Iran was the big victor, right? They had mobilized their proxies. They had showed that Israel's security could be punctured. Israel was reeling at a time that's politically difficult for Israelis, and we're suffering. Like, Iran would have been entirely plausible to think they had the leading edge on this. But the second 6 months of this, the response to the Iranian attack on Israel, the continued American support for Israel despite international objections and domestic American objections, the continued support of the Arab states in the region for Israel despite the operations in Gaza, and the effectiveness of Israeli assassinations in Tehran, in Lebanon, and even in Syria, and the aggressiveness with which Israel is prosecuting the case against Iran. It's possible to me Israel might think now's the time to prevent the existential threat we are worried about of an Israeli nuclear program. But I'm running a betting pool on what the Israeli response against Iran will be. And my bet is placed that they will not try a high-level targeted assassination, which I think could draw a wider war. And I don't think they will go after Iranian oil infrastructure because of what that would do to global oil markets and to the economies, not just of the United States, but of many other countries. If I were betting, and I am, on what the Israeli retaliation would be, if I were the Israeli National Security Advisor, I would argue to sink the Iranian Navy to ensure that the Straits of Hormuz would be uninterdicted. It's a legitimate military target. It won't kill civilians. Israel has already demonstrated it can target the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. They did that in their last retaliation by going into the middle of Iran and targeting a radar and the nuclear sites. So they don't have anything to prove there. But the Iranian Navy could interdict the 30% of global shipping that goes through the Straits of Hormuz. And it has a nice ring of historical resonance to what the Reagan administration did in the 1980s in Operation Praying Mantis.
So, Kori, let's assume Israel does that or something like it. In either scenario, we're going to have a new president here in the United States in 2.5 months that is going to inherit a very volatile and ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah, and then, of course, this proxy war with Iran. We have the war in Ukraine ongoing without any end in sight. And then there is just the growing belligerence of China at the same time that China's economy is kind of in a bit of a tailspin with its collapsing property market. You, though, Kori, have said you have some real issues with the foreign policy approach of both Harris and Trump, that you see some real deficiencies in both of their approaches. Could you distill what those are? What is wrong with the worldview as articulated by Harris and Trump, as you see it?
Yeah.
And what would make them maybe ill-equipped to deal with all those challenges we just talked about?
So I should admit up front that I'm one of those establishment Republicans who in 2016, 2020, and 2024 signed the letter saying, I won't vote for Trump and I won't work for Trump, because I think he's a genuine danger to the Constitution. So I know I'm not going to like a lot of Harris foreign policy if she's elected, but I don't think she's a danger to the Constitution, just as I didn't think President Biden was a danger to the Constitution, and I didn't think Secretary Clinton was a danger to the Constitution. So I think President Trump's worldview is one of threatening America's closest friends with abandonment to aggression if they don't support either his preferences for their defense spending or his preferences in their foreign and trade policies. I think he fundamentally believes that strong states have a right to do whatever they want, that they have a right to a sphere of influence. He talks that way about Ukraine. He talks that way about Taiwan. And that really is a fundamental rejection of 70 years of American foreign policy. Out of the ashes of World War II, the United States and its allies built an international order in which we believe that people have rights and we loan them in limited ways to governments. And governments, small, large, powerful, or weak, have rights in the order. And we will protect the rights of sovereignty and self-determination, right? I mean, that's what Woodrow Wilson wanted in the 14 points. That's what the Atlantic Charter in World War II, before the United States even entered the war. And that's what the international order the United States and its allies built afterwards. I think President Trump genuinely doesn't believe that's in America's interests. He believes allies are not an advantage to the United States. They are free riders at best and burdens at worst. And he's also fundamentally mercantilist, right? He doesn't believe in free trade. He believes in industrial policy. Vice President Harris, I think we have a tendency to ascribe to her the virtues of liberal internationalism, but we don't actually know. We don't actually know much about what she thinks about the world. And she hasn't been a major force in policymaking. She has avoided saying as much as she can on subjects other than a belief that allies are good for the United States, and to her great credit, a belief that Russia's invasion of Ukraine shouldn't be permitted to succeed. In that, she is quite different from former President Trump, who himself seems to think that Russia has a right to determine the alliances and the economies and the political structures of its neighbors. Vice President Harris is almost every bit as bad as former President Trump on trade policy. And it's such a mystery to me because the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does annual surveys of American attitudes on foreign policy issues, and they have never recorded more support than at present among Americans for trade as benefiting my family's kitchen table economy. So both parties are missing an opportunity that Americans can see that trade is good for us, and engaging in trade agreements that create a level playing field where others have to play by the rules that we are going to play by is actually really good for growth. It's good for the economy, and it's good for American foreign policy.
But Kori, that's what I want to ask you about before we get to a couple of questions of our audience. This last big question, because this is such a defining issue. Both Trump and Harris are more favorable towards tariffs than almost any of their predecessors. And of course, all of us remember from our history classes about the Great Depression, and we all learned about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which made it worse.
Exactly.
But here's the thing, what I'd like to understand is, intuitively, I think most people understand, hey, wait a minute. If we, the United States, put a tariff on the aluminum coming into our country, then on balance, I'm going to pay more for the stuff that I buy in the aluminum cans. And that's going to make my life more expensive. What is it that the trade people around Trump and Harris, what is their counter to that? Do they just miss that as a concern and say, well, look, you know what? Yes, you're going to pay more, but that's a price worth paying to help U.S. domestic manufacturers? Or do they just question the premise of that concern?
So I think neither of them acknowledge the fundamental economic truth you just outlined, Ryan, which is that this means American consumers are going to pay more. And an honest advocacy of tariff policy is to tell Americans it's worth it to preserve manufacturing jobs in America. It's the equivalent of the European Union preserving farming in France and Germany, right? It's much cheaper to do it elsewhere in the world and import food, but they've made a social and political and economic choice not to do that. But the leaders of neither political party are acknowledging that in the US. And I think there are two strains of argument of how we got here. One is that American manufacturing has actually caused the loss of manufacturing job. The smart automation that American businesses have brought in is the major reason for the collapse of good union jobs in manufacturing in the United States in the last 25 or 30 years.
Right.
And we're not owning up to that this is what increased productivity looks like. But the second thing is that foreign trade actually isn't problematic. Allowing China to become part of the global trading regime without requiring China to play by the rules that all the rest of us play by, that's what outsourced jobs from the United States to China. Now, mostly these are not jobs that Americans actually have any enthusiasm for doing, but still, the perception of manufacturing fleeing to China, there's legitimacy to that argument, but it's not an anti-trade argument. It's an anti-China argument.
Yeah. So ultimately, what then, despite these issues you're talking about, why then do you think Trump and Harris are both leaning into it? Is it as simple as they think the benefits of appealing to manufacturing workers in Pennsylvania and Michigan outweighs any damage it would do to the economy?
Yes. And I think the definitive proof of that is that Hillary Clinton, when running for president in 2016, she had helped negotiate the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership that would have brought 19 countries into alignment on American standards of environmental protection, of labor protections, and reduce tariffs among those countries, most of whom we do not have tariffs against, but had tariffs against the United States. And it excluded China. And yet Hillary Clinton campaigned against the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership.
Right.
And I think that has to do with the fact that the benefits of trade are widespread, but the costs of transition are narrowly focused, and they're narrowly focused in important electoral states. And nobody came up with the get out of jail free card that served us so well when we brought in NAFTA, which is transition payments to industries and people that would have been affected by the loss of those jobs.
One last question for you, Kori, before we get to our audience questions, which is this. And I want you to imagine you're back on the National Security Council, even though you've already said you won't be taking that job no matter what next January. But if you were counseling the next president in January of next year, and you had to say to them, look, by the end of these 4 years of your administration, these are the 2 or 3 things that you need to have gotten done to make this country stronger and safer. What would those things be?
The first thing would be entitlement reform, because the national debt is actually our greatest vulnerability, and interest payments and entitlements are crowding out discretionary spending of both domestic and defense policy. And we're not owning up to that problem, and it's going to hit us hard if we don't begin making the small marginal adjustments that will help us bring deficit spending and the debt under control, and will rebalance our current investments against our entitlement payments to Americans. The second thing I would say is that we are talking ourselves into a belief that the world has never been more dangerous, and we are weak in comparison to the challenges. And that's just wildly historically inaccurate. George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, they would love to have the problems we have, which are the problems of a dominant power in the international order, prosperous and strong, and aligned with the other strongest states in the international order in preserving a mutually beneficial order that mostly keeps us safe and mostly keeps prosperity advancing. We're talking ourselves, whether it's fear of escalation over assistance to Ukraine, or fear of addressing the North Korean and Iranian nuclear threshold states, we're acting like we're the ones who should be fearful, instead of we're the ones who can orchestrate broad international responses to these problems. And that's an enormous luxury that we take for granted at our peril. You know, so I have to say, I've been in Europe this week, in Brussels and in Rome, and my sweet sister is the communications director at the Walt Disney Company. And we very often talk about American power in the international order. And Christina very often points out to me that I think the American military and government policy is American power, and she thinks American culture is America's superpower. And I think we're both right in different ways, but I have been walking around Brussels and Rome taking pictures of Halloween decorations, because that is American cultural hegemony, that this sweet, stupid holiday that is unique to our country is becoming universal because it's just nice. And the magnetism of American culture and American power when we do it right, it reduces the cost of everything else we try and do in the world. And we really shouldn't forget that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like your big idea there is a lot more exports of Mickey Mouse, but which I am not going to dispute. That's a great idea.
Frozen, Moana. Like there's lots of goodness.
My daughter loves them all. Let's start with some questions. Dorsey, go ahead. And if you could just say where you're from. Dorsey.
Yes. Hi there. This is so juicy and enlightening, Kori. Thank you so much. So I'm Dorsey Cartwright, and my home is in Austin, Texas. I'm currently in Canada with my Canadian partner, but I head home soon. It's getting cold up here. But here's my question, and it really goes back to the beginning of y'all's conversation, and that was talking about that our military is under civilian rule. And Ryan, I think it was you that said something about that civilians are to be telling the military what to do, not the other way around. And I was just listening to one of the new books, Co-Wars by Dave Sanger, and in it talking about how, at least according to what he shared, what was pivotal for Biden's decision in the way that he pulled out of Afghanistan was that even though his military was warning him in various ways to either slow down or leave some troops in, or, that just pulling out was not going to go well. He, having been in the government for so long, and had seen over and over how the military always seems to think that they need to pull out more slowly or leave troops in or whatever, and that sometimes the military was wrong and got us in deeper. And so that was one of the primary reasons why he wouldn't listen to them, why he did it the way he did. And in that, in that particular instance, given the results for Afghanistanians, for us, for Biden, etc., it would at least appear to be not such a good choice. So I'm wondering what you all think about that.
So a couple of things. It's a wonderful challenge, and I'm really glad you raised it. So the only person who American people choose to decide these important issues of war and peace is the president. And so the military has a responsibility to give their counsel to the president, and the president has every right to ignore it because the military has narrow, specialized expertise, right, on the effective use of violence. But no American president has ever chosen to give 100% of national effort to a military fight. You have to keep the economy running. You have to balance political forces. You have to win elections. And so it is proper for the president to decide those issues, irrespective of the military's advice to him. The problem is that very often the military knows better than civilians what's likely to happen in the use of violence for state purposes. And in the case of Afghanistan, it wasn't just the military. The civilian leadership of the Department of Defense, the State Department's leadership, and the intelligence community were all on the same page of arguing to the president that it was going to be a mistake and it was going to be costly to do what he wanted to do. President Biden chose to ignore that advice, which is his right. But I also think the American public is really good at holding political leaders accountable for stuff like that. You saw President Biden support dropped by about 10 points after the debacle of Afghanistan withdrawal. And it actually never recovered because many Americans were ashamed to see Afghans clinging to the wheels of American aircraft as they were fleeing the country. What I know from the surveys Jim Mattis and I had YouGov do for our book on civil military relations in 2015 is that the American public is shockingly ignorant about defense issues, but their judgment is terrific. And one of the things Americans understand is that it's the president who decides on strategy and resourcing for the wars. And therefore, it's appropriate to hold the president accountable. And that's what they did with President Biden and the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Thanks, Dorsey. Thanks, Kori. Stacy, you have a question.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you and I would probably disagree about whether Hamas can be destroyed. We destroyed Nazism, we destroyed Nazi Germany, even though we didn't destroy Nazism, but that's probably a debate for another time. But talking about the Middle East, how much is America to blame? You talked about urban warfare and the amount of civilians and how bad it looks, but why President Biden isn't pushing on Hamas, because all Hamas needs to do is return the hostages and stop fighting, and the war would be over. Instead, it's Israel who is always being looked at and pressured. And the other thing is the Trump administration had gotten down the reserves in Iran, the cash reserves, to something like $4 billion. And under the 3 years of the Biden, they have pumped $200 billion worth of oil, most of it going to China. So the sanctions which are on the books are not being enforced. So how much is this prolongation of war really because of America's inability to set a policy and not understand that our fight is not really with Muslims, but it's with radical Islamic jihadism?
So those are great challenges. I think, though, it is unfair to put responsibility on the United States when we're not a party to the conflict. I agree with you that we are mostly trying to pressure the Israelis rather than Hamas. And I think the reason is because we have no leverage over Hamas. If I were Hamas, I'd never release those hostages because that's the only leverage they have. And Israel's doing a very good job of hunting down the leadership. And so that's the only card Hamas has. And we don't have much ability to affect them except to threaten them with extermination. And the Israelis are already doing that as best they can. So I think the reason we are trying to influence Israel is because it's the only party we have any influence over. But I agree with you that the culpable party for the humanitarian disaster in Gaza is Hamas, right? They are the ones hiding among civilians. They are the ones using hospitals as launch sites. They are the ones tunneling under schools and right? Like they're responsible. So on your second point about Iran, one thing is that the problem with Trump policy on Iran is that the US has had sanctions as much as we can put on Iran since 1979. What changed the dynamic of negotiations with Iran was the fact that we could get other countries involved in applying sanctions. The European willingness to go along with Obama administration sanctions on Iran was actually politically incredibly salient. And that the Trump administration did not act in concert with allies over Iran meant that we're back where we started from, where the US has maximum sanctions, but we have limited ability to prevent China from buying Iranian oil unless we're prepared to sink those ships, which I think neither the Trump or Biden administration was willing to do. So I agree with you that Iran has had an enormous financial windfall since in the last several years. But it's not just Biden administration fault, it is also Trump administration fault.
Thank you. David, you have a question.
Thank you. My question goes back to the subject that you opened up earlier, and that is, I don't see that this country currently has a political military end game for the conflicts that we are in. Is that because there is an end game, but we just don't know about it? Or is there no end game policy? And I'm calling from central Minnesota.
It's a great question. And my sense is that we are larding the use of military force with so many sophisticated and contradictory objectives that it's making it impossible to achieve things with military force. It's very fashionable, for example, to say that there's no military solution to the war in Ukraine. And that is just objectively incorrect, right? Because there's no negotiated solution that I can see on any terms that one or the other party to that conflict are going to stop fighting. So military force is going to solve that problem one way or another. Somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose for both parties to that conflict to stop fighting. And what we have done is say, well, we want Ukraine to win, but we don't want them to win so fast it might collapse Russia. And we don't want them to win on terms that might cause Russia to escalate to nuclear use or attack on a NATO ally, right? Those are contradictory objectives. And again, it comes back to the fact that we're so far away from thinking about warfare seriously that we're asking military force to do things so complex we're incapable of achieving objectives. The use of force is a blunt instrument. It breaks things and kills people. It can't achieve sophisticated political outcomes. And we have been counting on it to achieve sophisticated political outcomes. And we have also been counting on it to cross the gap between expansive political objectives and very limited forces. And that also, like, math class doesn't work that way.
You definitely have a disconnect between means and ends, that's for sure. Ian, question.
I'm calling from Blacksburg, Virginia, and my question is about the Harris campaign and its foreign policy strategy, particularly on Israel. So I feel like there's a pretty wide ideological array that they're trying to attract. You have a lot of centrist Democrats, moderate Republicans too, that they want to vote for Harris, who are liberal internationalists on foreign policy. But then there's people on the far left who are highly isolationist. They don't like Israel. So my observation there, I think, is that a lot of people within the camp that Harris is trying to attract have essentially irreconcilable foreign policy beliefs. And that's why she has pretty much yet to comment really anything of significant substance on Israel and a lot of other foreign policy issues. I'm curious what you think about that observation.
I agree with that judgment. I think you're exactly right. It looks to me like what Vice President Harris is trying to do is sustain the same policy that President Biden has had, which is support for Israel, provision of intelligence, weapons, and military support to Israel, organizing countries in the region into cooperation with Israel. What I think Vice President Harris has done is slightly change the way she describes that in order to alienate less than President Biden has alienated the left wing of the Democratic Party. She is sounding much more sympathetic to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the suffering of Palestinians than President Biden has sounded. But I don't distinguish any particular difference in the policy she is proposing.
Interesting. Kori, do you have time for just one more question?
Absolutely, I do.
Okay. Noel. And then, I'm sorry, we have Bob also. I think just two.
I'm happy to take them both.
Okay. Noel, go ahead.
Thank you, Kori, and thank you, Ryan. Noel from Los Angeles, California. Kori, rather, very curious about why Israel's response has been framed so much as a kinetic response. We know they're going to respond. We know that they have justification for a response. We know very likely that Israel's capabilities in cyber, the non-kinetic option, is very, very high, if not even more superior to that of the US. So they could disrupt, Iran's control systems, centrifuge, all their pipelines, their refineries, their telecom systems, all their government operations at very, very little cost. And the damage would be extremely contained. We likely would not see a kinetic response at all. So I'm just wondering why, the talking class has not really opined on that. We know they're the deadliest in the world when it comes to cyber capabilities. Israel is the best in the world. And there's a lot that has not come to light in terms of what their true capabilities are. And so I'm just very curious why there's really so much speculation around this, all out blow up war and nuclear options, when in reality, it may not be a part of that equation. Thank you.
So one of the things that has been so interesting, both about the war in Ukraine and about Israel's wars, is that national security experts thought that the wars would start with cyber war, right? That these were going to be flying sharks with lasers, and warfare was going to be totally new. And that actually hasn't been how either war has evolved. And I think part of the reason is that the United States has assisted both of those allies in shielding their government networks, their civil society, their critical infrastructure. And there's been a lot of interesting cooperation in that realm. But the other thing I would say is that for a country that has experienced a physical attack on the scale that Israel has experienced, from Hamas, the attempts once, now twice, by Iran, the attempts by the Houthi and Hezbollah to hit Israeli civil society, civilian targets. Cyber might not seem a good enough response. It's not visible enough. It's not painful enough. And so, at the end of the day, warfare continues to come back to the infliction of physical violence. And I think that's what we're seeing both in the wars in the Middle East and in the war in Ukraine, that cyber's a useful tool, but it's not demonstrable enough to be considered a standalone response to a physical attack.
Thanks, Kori. And Bob Goodman. Bob, go ahead.
This is Bruce Goodman. And
Hey, Bruce.
let's see. Okay, my question is about Iran, but I have to say I was surprised at your comment about Ukraine, that it's a military issue. I'll bet you a nickel that it's going to be resolved diplomatically with, stand in place kinds of stuff. But anyway, about Iran, both Israel and the US have said and most actors have said it's unacceptable for Iran to be a nuclear power. I guess basically the question is, why isn't now the best time to go after that when they're a week away? And the more you pummel them, the more incentivized they are to declare themselves a nuclear power, and then we're in a terrible position. I guess if not now, when?
It's a great challenge. And I agree with the logic of your argument that now's a better time than when Iran has crossed the nuclear threshold. But I would give you the North Korean example, right? We said for 20 years that we would not stand for nuclear armed North Korea. They now have 100 nuclear weapons. And it turns out we could stand to deal with a nuclear armed North Korea, because compared to fighting a war against North Korea, where the capital of South Korea and the 125,000 Americans who live in South Korea are immediate targets of North Korean attack, nobody was willing to push all their chips into the pot on that one. And I think that's what's happening with Iran as well, right? I genuinely worry that our policy, that the last 4 presidents wouldn't actually be willing to carry out our policy, which is, if Iran moves towards a nuclear weapon, we will destroy the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. That isn't a strike. That's a months-long campaign in which we go to war with Iran. And I don't think any of the last 4 American presidents really had the stomach for that kind of war against Iran in the Middle East when they're trying to ignore the Middle East. So you're right, it's a better choice, but I also think we're unlikely to take it.
Kori, thank you so much for taking a couple minutes with us today, especially from abroad. Do you have a title for your book yet that's coming out next year?
Oh, I have such a boring title. If anybody has a better one, please send it to me. The current boring title is The History of Civil-Military Relations in the United States.
Well, that's also truth in advertising.
It's not great though. So any of you smarties have a sparkly title, send it to me, please. I'd appreciate having a better one. Thank you so much for this smart conversation, my friends. And thank you for all you contribute to making American politics a better place.
Thank you, Dr. Kori Schake, for being with us. Can't wait for you to come back with us again. And thank you all for joining us on this week's edition of No Labels Talks. We'll see you all next week.